Well, I'm sorry for coming on late. Technical difficulties. I've been having them for weeks now. I thought I had them all ironed out, but I guess I didn't. All right. Let me look over all of the equipment and see that things are all right. All right, I guess we're okay. We'll find out quickly. This is a continuation of a talk we started last time. We're talking about spiritual hierarchies. In a very quick review, we've learned the following. We've learned that when we're talking about hierarchies, we're not talking about the gods of mythology like Zeus or Apollo or things like that. Though sometimes in mythology they actually do talk about hierarchies. For example, in Greek mythology they talk about Oreads and Hamadryads and things like that, and those are actually part of the spiritual hierarchies. Now, we're saying that though the hierarchies have individuals as part of them, the individual part of a hierarchy is not as important as the general character or the general body of all of the members of a given hierarchy. It's something like the larger picture is more important than the detailed individual. It's something like one drop within a wave. The wave is what is all important, but it's made up of many drops that are indistinguishable from each other. Another thing we learned in the last talk is that our humanity constitutes such a life wave. We are a hierarchy, a hierarch, I should say, collectively. Now, the last thing and the most important thing in terms of the way we live our lives that we came up with last time is that in our human life wave, we are dangerously pronounced in our individuality. It is important that we develop our selfhood. That's part of the specialty of our hierarch, but we're carrying it too far. All right. The way we're trying to do it is we're trying to act in such a way that the individual acts with consciousness of the whole. We have some of that in team athletics or in orchestras or things like that. One does one's part, but one does one's part with relative to the whole. All right, now we're going to go a little further. This is going to be a very unusual night tonight. Let's look at hierarchy in our daily lives. In our daily lives, we have hierarchy. We have laborers, peons, and then we have supervisors or managers, and then on the higher levels, we have executives. Now, if we look at them in person, they're indistinguishable. The laborers may wear laborers' clothing, and the executives might wear suits, but if we saw them all naked, we couldn't tell that one was different from the other in terms of their hierarchical capacity. The factors that determine aptitude, skill, education, know-how, all of those things are invisible. Now, this sort of thing is true, and it isn't true at the same time when you're talking about spiritual hierarchies. Viewed spiritually, in some ways it isn't even true of humans. Now, this is an extremely touchy subject, and I don't mean to make any biased statements, and I don't mean to hurt anyone's feelings or anything like that. But some people who are immature and insecure find security by identifying with others. When their insecurity is challenged, they refer to those with whom they identify, their personal heroes. Now this might be as simple as a child in a dispute with another child saying, "My father can lick your father." And I've even heard it said in conversations, "My guru is more powerful than your guru." It's very sad. As we have seen, ultimately, in Virgin Spirit, all of us are equal. Creatures, humans, divinities. In Virgin Spirit, we're all equal. However, in creative manifestation, we are not all equal. Some have experienced more and learned more and done more in creation, and they are more advanced than others. And the inequality is not a bad thing. In fact, inequality is sometimes a means to make a change, a meaningful change. All the water behind the dam is quiet, nothing is, nothing doing there, but the inequality of the gravitational mass on one side of the dam versus the other side of the dam is what makes possible the generation of hydroelectric power. So inequality is an important thing. It is also a fact that difference in creative spiritual consciousness is necessary to the accomplishment of every creation. Hierarchies are indeed hierarchical, and one can advance because of the steps in a hierarchy, and because of the perspective of those in the higher hierarchies it's important. Now, this is dangerous territory because among humans there is a hierarchy in terms of spiritual development. Some people are more spiritually advanced than others. They're more awake, they're more loving, they're more spiritually conscious. But being able to distinguish this is a tricky business. And it's especially tricky in trying to understand one's own place in a hierarchy of development. We have, with our egoism, we have a deviant kind of, or perverted kind of evolutionary consciousness. We're not only highly individualized, we are so in a very selfish way. We're very egoistic. Now, thus, we're subject to vanity of the worst kind, spiritual vanity. Now, if a person is vain, one is subject to illusion, and sometimes the illusion is dangerous. We can't hide ourselves in a dark cave. We have to be out in the world. Now we want to be able to help others spiritually. If we do have this conceit, which may or may not be egoistic, of ourselves as having light or insight, we want to be able to help other people. But if we do that when we're under an illusion about ourselves or about reality, we have to come to terms with that before we can do anything. And that's very much a matter of self-judgment. In the spiritual school in which I try to grow, one of the most important parts of spiritual development is being able to judge oneself. And this we try to do daily and on a more rigorous way monthly and even more rigorously annually. That we try to judge and see our objectivity and whether we have actually grown or not. So clear, objective spiritual judgment is important. Now, to the degree that a person does have spiritual judgment, only to that degree can they judge others to be able to help them. Now, suppose, for example, one is a spiritual teacher. I am not a spiritual teacher, but suppose one is that. One seeks to help another by helping to help them to clear up a problem that they're having with their advancing their consciousness or becoming more aware. Now, if the person they're helping is not ready, and you offer something to them, like an advanced spiritual exercise, you can do serious damage, psychological damage, and even you can even put them in a mental institution. So judgment is a very important thing if we want to help people, and helping people is one of the best things we can do. Now, as I said, I'm not a spiritual teacher myself. I'm a spiritual philosopher, and I work at spiritual development, but I can't take somebody else's spiritual life into my hands. But I have done astrological and spiritual counseling on a minor level, and I have made regrettable errors. They happen less often now because I work very hard on having clear judgment. Now, this is one of the goals of someone training to be a clairvoyant, to have objective consciousness of the higher worlds. Now, suppose we had somebody who was developed and had a trained kind of clairvoyance. And suppose you went on the street and picked up 3 different people, not known to each other or anything like that, and put them into something like a lineup, like they have in with the police when they put them in a lineup and you're supposed to identify who is who. A trained clairvoyant should be able to determine which of those 3 people is more spiritually awake. And it's usually a very simple matter. It's the one that has the most light, that is surrounded by the most light. And even people who are not clairvoyant but are on the edges of it, you can see that some people always look like they're dirty. And it doesn't depend on skin color, but some people always look like they're dirty, and that's because they have often dishonest consciousness. You know, their aura is permeated with that sort of thing. Now, for those who do not have trained clairvoyance, that doesn't mean you're at a loss. But if you have developed an internal communion with your higher self, even if it's broken and most of the time is not there, you still have intuitive insight. And with intuitive insight, you can determine spirituality. Sometimes it's surprising that you find someone that has a very unassuming exterior, and intuitively you know that this person is very spiritual, and eventually it proves to be true. Now, all of this applies to the relative spirituality of spiritual hierarchs. In all of this, even for trained clairvoyance, soulful humility is what opens up the intuition and even the spiritual vision. Without humility and the intuition that is born of humility, you're in a bad place. Because we're discussing hierarchies, all of which are more spiritually developed than humans. So it's a lesser trying to understand the greater. And unless you have a spiritual vision, and sometimes even with spiritual vision, and unless you have intuitive insight, you're in a bad place. A lot of people make their living off of this very thing. They are pool sharks and card sharks. A pool player can make a shot look just as if it was a lucky shot and keep leading you on because your consciousness of the pool table and the abilities on the pool table are less than the pool sharks. And the pool shark can be a pretty cagey person. I had a friend once that was taken in by a pool shark, and he left with the clothes on his back and nothing more. He was a gambling man. I liked him a lot. A lesser cannot really truly judge a greater. We can get a general picture, or we can get an insight that something is more valuable by grace, or if we have intuition. The higher things are in consciousness and spiritual development, we're talking about beings that are truly divine beings. It's all a matter of light. And it isn't like the light that comes out of the lights of this room. It is a spiritual light, and the brighter it is, it doesn't hurt your eyes. But it does tend to awe you. So everything is a matter of light. So when it says in the Bible, God is light, that's a literal statement. It's as deep of light as can be conceived. Now the mythological gods and goddesses aren't, they have human emotions and even human weaknesses. But they're often given idolized human bodies. The Greeks especially like to make their ideas of perfect bodies, and then they assigned them to the gods. I remember one time I was in the Getty Museum in outside of Los Angeles, and there they had only a part of a statue of a Kore, and Kore was the goddess of the center of the earth. And that thing was so beautiful that I couldn't move for a good number of minutes just looking at the idealized perfection of that body. And this is the kind of things that the Greeks did. Their gods had human shapes. And that's not the hierarchies. The spiritual hierarchies, in the first place, bodies are not as important. And they're not made up of chemicals. So the bodies take shape functionally. There is a kind of matter in the various spiritual worlds in which the hierarchies are manifest, but it's a much different type of, it's a much subtler matter. It's gossamer, and it's transparent, and it's alive with various different types of spiritual liveliness. Some of it is vitality, and some of it is what we call energy, but there are other forms of liveliness in the higher spiritual worlds. In general, most of the hierarchies in their collective nature and in their individual manifestations are much larger than these kinds of human bodies. If you start thinking of the earth itself as the physical body of a hierarchy, you'll get an understanding that the aura or the higher spiritual vehicles of the earth extend thousands of miles, millions of miles into space. The bodies because they are lively and energetic, energy in parentheses, are more like fields. So the concepts of people seeing angels with wings and wings having feathers, those are not the case. That's not true. Even though witnesses claim that is true, they don't realize that what they're doing is superimposing their personal beliefs on what they're seeing, and they're not seeing the reality itself for what it is. So these are organized, lively formations. But they don't have organs, they don't have livers or knee joints or anything like that. They are fields of lively spiritual state. The only way that they resemble a body like a human body is they have faces. At least that's true of the lower hierarchies. I don't know about the higher hierarchies at all. They're way beyond. So, we have large energy bodies with intelligent human faces. Astoundingly beautiful human faces. The body of a hierarch of a mountain is the consciousness of everything evolving in and on and through that mountain. So we're talking about a body that's hundreds of miles in diameter. And its consciousness permeates, and within it are sub-hierarchies and things like that. So when we're talking, we can't talk about bodies of hierarchies as we can talk about hierarchies, as we can talk about bodies of humans. Now, there are some characteristics about the bodies of different hierarchies. They exist on different levels, states of spiritual being. We've talked about that for all the years that we've had these talks on mysticism. We've talked about the physical, chemical subdivision of the physical world, which we see every day. And we've talked about the etheric subdivision of it. And we've talked about the desire world and the world of thought. There are higher and higher spiritual worlds. We're sort of at the bottom here. We're at the end of the line. Now, the body of a hierarch of a mountain, for example, covers everything in and through the mountain. Density and interpenetrability are another matter. Each world, as one ascends through the spiritual world, is rarer. And it's more extensive, goes further and further out into space. But each world is also more dense. There's less likelihood of gaps in the manifest reality. Dimensionality is another matter. I don't know about all of the dimensions of all of the spiritual worlds. I have enough difficulty understanding third and fourth dimensionality, and sometimes even two-dimensional things. Using a dimensional model, we would be, let's just say like the three-dimensional world. Suppose we took right here, let's see. Suppose we took just a cubic meter of space in a three-dimensional sense. We would be tremendously astounded at how many different beings interpenetrated this 1 cubic meter of space. It's, when people say that God is closer than hands and feet, they're pointing to a reality that one understands more and more as you unfold spiritually. I remember one time a few years ago, I read a lot of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a spontaneous, controlled clairvoyant in the 18th century. He was a mining engineer who one day found himself opened up clairvoyance that he could control. There's gossip about him. The gossip is, Rudolf Steiner, for example, says that Emanuel Swedenborg was Ignatius Loyola in a previous life. He was the founder of the Jesuits and then went to Sweden in order to avoid the Jesuits. I don't know. There are funny things that maybe not completely kind. But he describes one day of looking and seeing beings in the spiritual worlds, and as he was focusing intently on them, everything opened up, and within and behind them were even more grand spiritual beings, and he was astounded by that. And as he focused on them, it opened up, and he could see things more subtle, and he could see beings within and beyond those. And he takes this through about 3 or 4 replications. And reading this 300 years later, my hair almost stood on end, because it carried through the experience that he was having at that time. All right. Now, just as light and its intensity and quality there is, I have to get back to my notes right here. Light with its quality and its intensity, like if one person is definitely more spiritually awake than the other, he has more light. There are other things that are indicative. Color, for example. Color is a significator of a mood, of a quality of the light. And it's more than emotion in the divine beings. It's a quality in higher worlds and higher dimensionality. Just because color is specialized in the desire world doesn't mean that there isn't color also in the world of thought, and so on. So unlike the auras of humans, the auras of hierarchies are more constant. Our auras are changing and flashing, and it's just a thing of awe to see a person, especially a person who changes their mood a lot. It's something quite shocking almost. But some of the divine beings, the auras of their being are constant, so much so that we consider them constants of nature. Now there are paradoxical or seemingly paradoxical things about this sort of thing. At the same time that it is necessary to be able to see the higher spiritual worlds, one has to have a finer and a more subtle focus and discernment to view them. I don't know how to say it. It requires an adjustment and focus that involves refinement, discernment, and subtlety. Painters, especially landscape painters, I knew a man that painted desert landscapes. And when you looked at them, they had all sorts of a glow of color on all of the landscape in little pockets here and there. And asked him about it. And he said, you start looking at them and you look at them intently, any area in the desert or any other setting for landscape, you begin to see the lights that are there. We have eyes, but we see not, is the biblical statement, and we don't really look, and we don't focus. So it is like this, especially with the spiritual world. We don't see because we don't look in a way, and we can't distinguish one state of being from another because we do not intensely focus our attention and with subtlety look for differences, and then passing through those differences see something more on a higher level. Now the qualitative character of color brings us to another thing about creative hierarchies. It's about the heavens. Not the higher world's heavens, but the heavens that if we go out on a starry night and see the stars, that heaven or those heavens. The spiritual hierarchies are associated with the Zodiac and with influence that is called astrological influence, but it's just influence. It passes through the spiritual worlds, and one thing communicates its being itself to another in the same way that fields of attitude are focused to us or presented to us from the hierarchies of the Zodiac. Now, at one time, the divine hierarchies participated in our evolutionary development. We could even see them. St. Paul talks about it very clearly. He says, we used to see this all the time, but because we perverted ourselves, we closed ourselves off to seeing these things. When we declared our divinity by taking the creative energy into our own hands and doing so wantonly, we lost communication directly and seeing or having direct communication of one kind or another with the divinities. Now, when we're going to talk about hierarchical influence relative to the Zodiac, we're getting into an area that there is controversy. I'm going to state things, and I'm going to state them from experience, and I'm going to state them from experience as a spiritual aspirant and not merely as an astrologer. There are two zodiacs. One is based on the fixed stars that we see with our eyes. If we go out and look and we see Vega or something like that, there is a zodiac comprised of fixed stars. It's called the sidereal zodiac. Some people call it the natural zodiac because the stars are part of nature. And other people call it the constellational zodiac because it's made up of groupings of stars, constellations. And the zodiac are those that are along the sun's path. The other kind of zodiac is based on the divisions of the ecliptic, the same ecliptic, but it's not based on the stars or collections of stars, but it's based on 30-degree segments from the point of the vernal equinox, which is when the sun is exactly on the equator at the first day of spring. You cannot see this kind of zodiac It is called the tropical zodiac, though some call it the intellectual zodiac because it's a zodiac that exists in one's mind. Or some people call it the sign zodiac because it's made out of signs instead of constellations. Now, because the Earth wobbles on its axis, it turns on its axis, axial rotation, and it revolves through the ecliptic. But those are all forward movements, but at the same time, there is a wobble in the pole of the Earth. And because of that wobble, the equinoctial point occurs at a little bit earlier time every year. It takes about 72 years for it to go 1 degree forward in the sidereal zodiac. And one wobble takes 28,856 years. And that means only for one period of about 72 years in that 28,000 year cycle are the two zodiacs lined up. Spring will always be spring, but there will be different stars behind it at spring. The relationship between the two zodiacs represent the nature of history. I won't go into it now because there are remarkable things about the history of religion and the history of religious architecture and quite a few other things, even heroes of different precessional periods. I have 3 lectures, and if anybody wants to see those lectures, or videos like this, please be in touch with me at 99fots@gmail.com, and I will send you a list of the various lectures on the subject. All right. Now, remember, this is controversial. And in the same way that some people identify with other people as their power figures, some people identify with their kind of astrology. Some people do astrology according to the fixed star zodiac, and some people do it with regard to the tropical zodiac, the sign zodiac. Both zodiacs are true. Both zodiacs work. Both zodiacs it's not that one is right and that one is wrong. Immediately that clears away a lot of controversy. The tropical zodiac is local. It's local to our Earth. So it relates to phenomena that are earthly phenomena. And for the people of the Earth, it relates. I've never made a study of it, but I do know that all planets have solstices and equinoxes. Venus probably the least, because Venus is almost perfectly upright in the band of the ecliptic, and so there would be very little difference. It wouldn't be a big summer-winter difference like we have on Earth. Pluto has a really different one. So all planets have seasons, and the seasons vary according from planet to planet. Also, all planets wobble, but they don't all have the kind of wobble that produces the precession of the equinoxes. I've never studied all the different kinds of wobbles because I don't have much to do with life on Jupiter or Saturn or Mercury or anything like that. It doesn't have relevance to me. Now, in the Western civilization, most of the astrology has been with the tropical zodiac. And for psychological understanding the tropical zodiac is clearly superior. You don't understand things psychologically as well with the sidereal zodiac. In fact, in India, they have a totally different sidereal astrology. They don't even do the same things to get at personal character that are done in the West. If you've ever made an open-minded comparison of what Aries is in the sidereal zodiac and what it is in the tropical zodiac, and look at people that you know that have pronounced characteristics, you can see it's very obvious that the descriptions of personal human things are much better in tropical zodiacs. It may be that with the precession of the equinox, because behind the tropical Aries there are different stars, the quality of Aries might vary during the precession of the equinox, but I don't have the kind of consciousness that I can see over several thousand years how the Aries of one time were different from the Aries of another time. That's beyond me. There's a glitch to this, because every astrologer, no matter how entrenched they are in tropical astrology, everyone will admit that there are times that individual fixed stars become very significant. So any astrology that's going to be accurate in describing human character gets a basic pattern from the sign, but individual fixed stars have to be taken into account if you want to be accurate. So there is a blending all the way through. Now, all things local to the Earth. Remember, we said that tropical astrology is a local astrology. If we take agriculture, it's a very good example. We plant our seeds in the northern hemisphere when the sun is in the tropical Taurus. Not the constellation, but the from between 30 and 60 degrees from the equinoctial point. Now, if we did this according to sidereal Taurus, if we had our agriculture based on sidereal astrology, we'd starve for most of the 25,868 years. We'd starve because we'd be planting seeds in the middle of winter or when fall was coming on. So you can see that agriculture makes it very, very clear that the tropical zodiac is important for local things. But again, the same thing happens if you plant when the moon is conjoined a certain fixed star, and according to the tropical zodiac, you'll likely have more success, or you'll have dwarfed plants or things of that nature. So we can see that there is a tropical zodiac that is local. Now, let's look at the sidereal zodiac so we can understand what we're dealing with when we're dealing with hierarchs and their sidereal or their astrological influence. Now, on the surface of the Earth, all of the stars are basically at infinity. It doesn't make any difference what part of the Earth we view a star from, it's at infinity. In fact, we can't even tell distances of stars except by ones that are closer to us than others. By parallax we do it. Even our distance from the sun is negligible. We're approximately 93 million miles from the sun, but from the closest star that we know of, the sun and the earth are one. They're just one point. So when we're talking about sidereal astrology, we're talking about something that relates to the entire solar system. We may think Pluto is very far out there, but relative to the fixed stars, it is as nothing. So what we're saying is that the solar system as a whole, and the solar system, we haven't come to it yet in these talks, the solar system is that original ball in which all of us were radiated to by the Lords of the Flame back in the Saturn period. In the Earth period in which we are now living, that has congealed into our solar system. So that one thing has developed in this way. So the same hierarchies that have been radiating to us since the beginning, from the dawn of the Saturn period, are zodiacal. They have that kind of reference that the whole is as one. Now, each planet does have its own tropical orientation, but the whole relates to the zodiac, and that is sidereal. That's naturally the way we treat it sidereally. So we're trying to understand spiritual creative hierarchies. And the mystery schools have found that they have astrological orientation. Now we can see that since the entire solar system as a whole is but a dot in the sidereal makeup of things, it has to be the sidereal zodiac. However, since the Hermetic axiom applies as above, so below, there is an analogy. Even though the entire emphasis or influence from the hierarchies in the sidereal zodiac is on the whole solar system, the signs in the tropical system are a subset of that. So there is a relationship between, say, the sidereal Gemini and the mundane or the sign Gemini in the tropical zodiac. All right, now I have the task of understanding what a zodiac is as it is found by mystics. This is a surprisingly and unexpectedly difficult task. How did the zodiac originate? Now, for many centuries, scholars have put forth theses, and the most common of them is that the zodiac originated with bucolic people who had nothing to do with their nights. They couldn't go to the disco club or whatever. So they would look at the stars at night, and then being bucolic people, they pictured and they saw this animal and that animal, and that's how the zodiac came to be, came to be what it is. It's like that cloud looks like a ducky, or that group of stars looks like a lion. And that's the way they've been looked at for many centuries. It neglects the fact that going back as far as we can go back, studying zodiacs and the historical knowledge back to ancient India, a lot of myths that are parallel between the East and the West have nothing to do with whether it looks like a ducky or a hippopotamus or whatever. So the thesis that the zodiac is a agreed upon imaging of many people over many centuries, that's a product of human imagination and nothing more, that doesn't hold water. Now, different people have had different theories about this. And mystics have had their own say. For example, there was a famous Neoplatonist mystic called Porphyry. And he writes in his treatise on the Cave of the Nymphs, which is a study of a little segment of the Odyssey by Homer from a mystic point of view. His statement is there were zodiacs. The zodiac existed before the stars. That's quite a profound statement. And what he's saying is Porphyry was a Neoplatonist, and all the Platonists and the Neoplatonists were mathematical philosophers studying spiritual mathematics as much as just plain mathematics. For example, Plato saw the earth. He says, when you get out in space, and mind you, he literally says this, like he could leave his body and go out into space. And what he says, from out in space, the earth looks like what we now call a soccer ball. He called it a ball that is patched together that children play with. And that figure is presumed to be a dodecahedron. A dodecahedron is a 12-sided three-dimensional figure where each of the faces or each of the hedra is an equilateral pentagon. And so they're all together, it looks something like a soccer ball, a very flattened out soccer ball. And that is to the Platonists, who were very great abstract thinkers, to them that represented 12 around the 13th. And it is a matter of fact that if you take ping pong balls and you try to put as many as you can around one central ping pong ball, you get 12 around the 13. You can get no more. That is optimal, or that is the least, the most that you can get. If those 12 ping pong balls are just dots that have only space, like in Pythagorean space or mathematical space, you still get only 12 around the 13th. And if you study condensed matter physics, which used to be called solid state physics, all of the packing of structures in three-dimensional space is based on that principle of 12 around the 13th. So we have a Platonic idea that existed before there was even a physical world in which we could live and have sense perception of the stars and of the zodiac. So Porphyry was really right about that. Now, let's advance a little bit more slowly into another view from mysticism that goes beyond Porphyry. According to one modern Western mystery school, the solar system is born and develops in the womb of the zodiac. It is as if to say that what is now the solar system began with something being surrounded by the zodiac radiating into it. This is exactly what we have been describing in the Saturn period, in the Sun period, and now in the Moon period. Because what we're talking about, planets and the Sun as a star, that didn't even exist then. There was this one blob, and it was surrounded by hierarchies, by 12 hierarchies, I assume. But in the Saturn period, it was the Lords of the Flame that were most active in radiating the germ of form into our being, so that it wasn't a zodiac as we think of the zodiac now, but the 12, and I don't think they were separated like the faces of a dodecahedron. There may have been 12 of them, but if they were separate in that way, everything would have to be spinning in a very unusual way for each being in that original ball that was being projected into. It would have to have a very complex motion. Whereas if there were 12 of them, but were all associated with all 12 points of view, that's a much more efficient way of going. And nature seems to, or the creative beings behind nature seems to work in a very efficient way. Now, it's a little different than the Platonistic view of a dodecahedron, but it's still there. Now, our discussion of cosmogony has been relative to our human life wave. And we know that there are other life waves, like angels and archangels and animals and plants. And it would be too inefficient to serve that many hierarchies for just one of 12 points of view. Now we're in the current Earth period. We haven't, in the discussion of cosmogony, we haven't come to the Earth period yet. We're having a hard time getting out of the Moon period. We have one more talk on this subject and one other subject before we get out of the Moon period. So we have at least 2 or 3 talks before we get to the Earth period. I don't mind going slowly as long as we're getting the ideas across and things are sinking into our consciousness so that we can understand and that we can see the way things work in the world as it is now. Now, in the Earth period, we have perceived evidence that is 3-dimensional. We sent people to the moon and done all of these things. And in the Earth period, we now have a condensed chemical physical world. And that means it is subject to the laws of mass and gravity. Physics and astronomy, or you can even do things of your own if you're clever enough, kitchen chemistry or kitchen astronomy or kitchen physics. It seems that the shape of the solar system now is a central ball. And around that central ball is a disk. It's an efficient vehicle for space because you find all sorts of vehicles in space with a ball in the center and a disk around it. The Earth, or the solar system, is the flying saucer, if you like to think of it that way. There is another, overall, the whole situation, there is a light sphere that covers it all, but that isn't where most of the activity takes place. Most of the activity takes place in the band, which from the Earth is the band of the ecliptic as we see it. Now, because this is the shape of momentum, you start spinning something, and the laws of momentum cause things to spread out, and that's the way the disk of the solar system developed. Now, because of this momental shape, the influence of the hierarchies is not from all over at the same time. That would be, again, inefficient. Since all of the activity, especially for dullards like ourselves, is on the planets and in that disk, the hierarchies have to work relative to that form. So we have the Zodiac as we see it now as a band of stars or a band of spiritual influences along the ecliptic. But it isn't just there. It's still in that overview, that overarching light sphere that surrounds the entire solar system. But if you take the north pole of the solar system and segment it into the whole sphere into 12 parts, it's something like a tangerine. You have those hunks of tangerine. If you have 12 of them, that dodecahedral concept gets placed on these, they're called lunes. The shape of the segments of a tangerine in astronomical term is called a lune. And most of the influence is where the loon is the fattest, and that is at the zodiac. And so that is what we see as the zodiac now. So we can see that this is the relationship of the hierarchies working through the zodiac at this time in the Earth period. And whereas previously they were associated in different ways, either abstractly or directly. Now it's pretty obvious, we are already at an hour, it's pretty obvious that we're not going to get to the association of the hierarchies with the constellations. It's too big of a topic. So instead of doing that, we're not even going to get to comparative creative activity. That'll have to be next time. That'll have to be part 3. I don't think there'll be a part 4. But so instead, we're going to look at something else, and we're going to look at it along the lines that we've been following. It is from one modern mystery school, and it is some of the strangest thinking I have ever encountered. It has challenged my credulity, my ability to believe or to even accept or tentatively study. It's about the origin of a zodiac. Now, in the talk previous to this, we talked about the cohesion of all the individualities of a hierarchy into a wave, and that the collective, the cohesion that forms the collective is stronger than each of the individualities. We use humanity as an example when we develop that line of thinking. We saw then that the human life wave is a whole. And there is something common to all of humanity that is undeniable. Now, the way we see things now as human beings is perverted. We put too much on the individuality, which is a universal spiritual being, but we put so much on it that we, in a way, try to cut ties with the whole and make too much of ourselves. That's going to change as our consciousness unfolds and we begin to understand our universality, and we understand that other people are experiencing that same universality and have the same goals. We will unite in love someday, and we'll see the reality of our common being. Now, the commonality that all humans share, that wave that is all of us, right now, it's based on the fact that all of us have had the same evolutionary experience. We all experienced the Saturn period and the taking on of form, and the Sun period and the taking in of life, and the Moon period where we now take on or in the ability to feel and to emote. Now that's one way that a life wave can relate to each other. There are many ways that they can, but for us mostly, as we described it, we described a common relationship based on common experience. There are other ways. And that is, one of them is that a collective can be associated in an evolutionary and creative way, can be associated with commonality of place. We find that in a simple way, that people who grew up on the prairie understand the prairie. You read Willa Cather's novels and you see that. Now, in recent years, astronomers have discovered something that mystics have been claiming for hundreds of years. And that is that many stars have planets. And that some of those planets even have satellites, like moons. Now, some mystics have been claiming this for a long time, and they have claimed that all planets, all stars have planets. Now, how and why planetary systems form is what we're going to talk about for just a few minutes. Now, this is going to be ridiculously abbreviated because I'm running out of energy already. So it's so abbreviated that it might seem funny, and you can laugh if you like. Fortunately, I don't have to hear the laughter here because I have the outgoing but not the incoming. Now, it appears to be a universal spiritual principle that a spiritual being in manifestation cannot reach its spiritual potential while retaining all of its concrete material manifestations. You can't take it all with you. You can't bring it all into the spirit. Now, these material concretions, the forms, are important for spiritual development. Our physical bodies are important. We can't take them into the higher worlds as we reach our divine potential. They would be, they would be a fetter, or there'd be something that held us back. We can't take them with us. So we can cast them off. We can pitch them out from ourselves. And those material forms are in effect something like our children. They are something that, our bodies are something we've created. And if we throw them off, they'll grow up, so to speak. And I'm not talking exactly right now about our physical bodies. Now, this is a very tiny, a minuscule statement of a very big principle. And apparently, this, like all principles, according to the Hermetic axiom, applies on larger and higher levels of being than we now experience here. Now, it is claimed that a sun, like our sun, or any star, cannot become a sun while retaining all of the concrete formation out of which that it is associated with. I don't know, I'll put it any other way. Something has to be thrown off. And it has to be kept at a distance for the good of the sun and for the good of the planet or whatever satellite. So in our solar system, the planets had to be thrown off before the sun could become a sun. This is nebular hypothesis. You can look it all up on the internet. It's clear. On the physical plane, it probably has something to do with fusion. The sun, as we know it, is a gigantic fusion, atomic or subatomic interaction, and if it had all that mass, it couldn't cut it. It couldn't do that. Now for the part that I have difficulty with, and that is the stuff is not merely stuff. It has quality and it has character. Like in our system, some of the planets are gaseous giants and some of them have metallic cores and such and so on. And the character of the planets and the beings evolving on them is relative. This is another principle, a huge principle, and I'm ashamed of myself for trying to say this much in this short of time. It's a principle that I know is true. And it's a principle that's active in purgatory, for example. And the principle is the material that is most incompatible with the spiritual center and the spiritual goal has to go first. So the cruddiest stuff has to go first. In purgatory, the first things that go are your most rotten, hateful emotions that you have. I know this is true because I participated in almost in a textbook example of an alternative cancer therapy. And the fact is that it is easier to get rid of a cancerous tumor than it is to get rid of a benign tumor. The body will tolerate the benign tumor, whereas the malignant tumor, it will not abide by that, and that is the first thing to go if you build up the immune system so that it's capable of throwing off what isn't for the good of the body. So, in the birth of the sun, the most developed beings and stuff go last. The first things to go are the lowest evolved beings. And it's a whole set of beings associated with a plant. And this varies from system to system. That there are different, there are harmonics. Like in our system, planets form according to what is called Bode's law. And that is the way the divinity, the collective divinity that is our solar system, it expresses itself in the scale of planets in distance and in a harmonic way. It's called Bode's law. You can look it up, B-O-D-E. You can look it up on the internet. They'll give you a very good picturing of it. And the production of planets has different qualities. Now, since different stars have different natures, the way they do this is likely to be different. Now, this is one of those coincidences. At the day after I wrote these notes, a paper was published by astronomers that said they have found 4 different ways so far that various different stars make planetary systems. So they don't all make them according to Bode's law as we do. And that's exactly what I had in the notes. It was just it's surprising. I guess it shouldn't be. And there are exceptions to this. That the lowest grade, the beings on Saturn, for example, are of a much lower grade. The humans that are associated with that planet, they're not on the surface like they are on Earth, are of a much lower grade than those of Venus or Mercury. But there is one exception in our system, and I won't go into that because this is not what this is about, and I'm not sure I can handle it anyway. But Jupiter is further out than Mars or the Earth, and Jupiter is the beings associated with Jupiter are much more advanced than those of Mars or the Earth. So we see that there are children of the sun, and the children of the sun had to be cast off so the sun could be what it was according to the laws of physics. There's a spiritual side to all of this, and each child has its own nature, has its own color, has its own quality, has its own keynote and everything else. Now we get into the things that are fantastic, and they challenge one's ability to accept them. The next progression in this is the mystery school claims that these planets as they evolve, each of them eventually, because they're associated with a common place. We said before it was common experience. Now we're seeing associated with a common place and a common experience. Each of these planets eventually becomes a sun in its own right. That doesn't happen in this creative manifestation, and everything will have to go into into a cosmic chaos and then come out, and then we will all be together again. We earthlings will be all together again as we become a sun. And this is pretty fantastic. It took me years to even consider this as possibly being true. But if you go out, even with the naked eye, if you go out and look at the stars, you see that there are stars of all different colors. Yes, there are some that range from more the blue-white all the way down to the red, but nonetheless, if you look out there, take a binoculars and look there are green stars and there are violet stars, and no, it is not so hard for me to accept the fact that those stars must have one time been planets, and that people, or that beings working together, whole hierarchies of beings working together, became a star. Now comes the part that is the next progression is even more difficult to accept intellectually. And the next progression is that after a collective of beings have been a star, they become a zodiac. And you have to be careful what you mean by that. It isn't like physically the stuff goes, but the consciousness that was once a planet that became a star, now that consciousness is capable of expressing through many different stars. In fact, it's probably contributory and hierarchical to many different stars as they are evolving. Because everything helps everything else, and so creation is a collective activity. Now, there are many, many questions about all of this, and it's pretty wild stuff. It's much more challenging, much more exciting, and especially if you can find something of it in yourself, better than watching television by any means. So that's about as much as we have for this evening. A little divertimento about the creation of a zodiac, or of zodiacal influence from many directions. There are a lot of other things that we could go into on this, but it's just too much. Next time, we will finally get to looking at what the hierarchies are and what their grade of creativity and what their grade of freedom is. I hope this hasn't been too crazy. I certainly hope that it inspires some individual thought about some of these things. You don't have to be an astronomer. Anytime you do any creative work, what you do in one painting is eventually going to spread into a whole zodiac of paintings that you do. All right, thank you very much.